everybody, thanks so much for joining me for the second to last, the penultimate episode of my Embroidery 101 series, where I take you from a piece of fabric and some floss to a finished needle book. Oops, I'm getting caught up in my thread here. To a finished needle book like this. And today we are going to be working on this section, this back section, which is putting the simple stitches that we learned all together into a kind of more cohesive piece. And so we have different kinds of stitches working together to create an image. This side was more tutorial and this side will just be kind of a stitch along. Now, if you haven't seen the earlier episodes, I will put the playlist in the eye at the top of the screen. You can click on that and watch how we, chose our fabric, how we hooped it, how we transferred the design, how we did all the different stitches. That's all available in the Embroidery 101 class. My name is Christy and I am an embroidery and textile artist as well as a cross-stitch pattern designer, and I wanted to introduce more people to simple surface embroidery. I find that a lot of people are slightly intimidated by surface embroidery because it is less strict, it is more free-flowing, and that kind of freaks people out sometimes. So I thought if I showed the people who watch my channel, just some simple stitches and we made a project together, maybe people would be more excited about doing embroidery. I have our gold color, which I think I'm using 3829, I think is what I'm using for this. Let me look at my notes here. Yes, 3829. And that's the gold color that I'm using. I'm using 3 strands of floss and I'm going to start over here with a chain stitch. Now I showed you 2 different kinds of chain stitches. I showed you a kind of standard chain stitch and then I also showed you a reverse chain stitch. For a circle you want to use a standard chain stitch, and the reason is because when you end the circle you want to be able to use that beginning stitch to have a seamless line. So that's what we're going to do, and I'm not going to like chatter through the whole thing. I'm going to speed it up unless I have something to say, just so that, I don't know, you all hear me talk all the time, so I don't want to bore anybody and I don't really have much to talk about right now. I have my away knot here and I'm already pulled up through and I'm going to start there. And for the chain stitch, of course, you go down through the same hole, come up 1 stitch away within the hoop and try not to get your thread caught on your hoop. And you create a chain. And I don't use a stand because my way of stitching, I have to move it around. And even when I do cross stitch, I stitch in hand just because I need to move it around. I can't just sit still, and it's just so uncomfortable for me. I think it's all about how you've learned how to stitch. And I learned how to stitch using a hoop in my hands. So I am almost out of thread here, and I want to have a seamless circle. So I don't want to tack this down. So what I'm going to do is pull off my needle, and normally I would have 2 needles, but I'm just going to use the 1 needle I have, take my 3 strands of floss, thread my needle, do my away knot, like I normally would, come up as if it is the other thread, pull that tight, and now I can keep going. And I just have to remember to you know, weave in all of my ends. So this is going to have extra ends to weave in at the end. And so here we are at the end, and for our last stitch, instead of going straight down into where we were, I'm going to flip my needle around and go through that first stitch and then down through, and we have a seamless circle, which I really love. So I'm going to weave in the ends and I'll be right back. I like to start on the flowers, and if we look at this here, we see that there are leafy vine things and also flowers, and I think we'll do this spool last. I want to start with the stems of these leaves, and as a general rule, I think about where things are positioned in relation to each other. So in cross stitch, everything is just flat and all of the dimension comes with color. In embroidery and service embroidery, you can layer things. I think I want my stems to be behind my leaves. That's what I want. Sometimes I want my stems in front of my leaves, but I think today I want them behind my leaves. So I'm going to start with my stems. I lied. Looking at this, I want to do the dark green first because I want to do those loops, and then I can come in with my light green and come back down doing these straight stitches, jump over here, do an outline stitch, and then come back with the straight stitches. I think that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to get out my dark green, which is 910. And this 910 is only used in these Lazy Daisy leaves. I don't use it anywhere else on this side. You, of course, can use it wherever you want, but I am not. This is how I normally work, where I'll plan out my stitching route because I want to have the fewest and shortest jumps possible. So there are 5 Lazy Daisies, and you can see the Lazy Daisies because they're the loop with the little line. So there are 5 Lazy Daisies on each vine. And I think I'm going to, here's where one starts here, right there. So I think I'm going to weave in here and then do just a little jump, as opposed to doing an away knot, simply because I don't have anything to weave it into right now. Although I will later, but we've already woven in. So it starts at the end of this vine, which is right there. And it is just a large-ish Lazy Daisy. And if you see this, some of them are tighter than others. So what I try to do is find which ones are super loose and like pull on them. You can adjust this to make it the kind of loop that you want. I want my loop a little bit loopier. So you just make it loose and tack it down. I don't tend to do Lazy Daisies much bigger than this. This is probably the largest I will do. And then we have quite a large jump to the next one. But that's okay because this will be covered up on the back by the stem, so you won't even see it. And now we just do another one. And I don't know if you can see this, but these lines here are not actually lazy daisy lines. They are the straight stitch lines. So these leaves are kind of a combination of two different stitches, a lazy daisy on the outside in the dark green and a straight stitch on the inside with a light green. And I think it makes a really nice, I don't know, a nice look. And it makes it look more complicated than it actually is. And that's really what embroidery is about. Yeah, that's really what embroidery is about. So now I need to come up here, but it will be this weird kind of line across. And again, I don't want that many jumps like that. So I'm actually going to weave it through here. And that is very loose, but that's okay. That'll catch itself. And then we can come up here and it's following this curve how we want it to. I should have done this one first, and then I could have woven it, but that's okay. So then we're going to do another leaf, and this is our final leaf on this branch. And I'm actually going to park this out here and come in and do the stem and the straight stitches, and then that will give me some place to weave that into, because at the moment I only have just kind of straight lines in the back, and that's not enough to weave into securely. So we're going to keep on going with our leaves. And again, I'm going to weave in down here. So this is where we're starting from here, right there. So I'm going to weave in here, and we'll come up where we want to start. And that way it's not that far of a jump. And we will do our stem stitch. And I do my stem stitch as a sewing, using the sewing method. I think the sewing method works very well for stem stitch. I think it's very effective, and it just goes much faster for me if I do the sewing method. And this is where our stem ends. So I want to do a full stitch. And then I think I'm going to come up at the end of our lazy daisy. Make sure, haha, see, that felt very, like a very quick pull. This is an easy kind of knot to get rid of. It's just kind of looped around. It's not actually a knot. And I will do a straight stitch like that. I will continue on my merry way and do straight stitches in these leaves. And again, if I jump down here, I'd have a line here unnecessarily. So I'll flip it over and just weave in through that like I did the last one, just to, you know, keep it neat. Neat and tidy. I like neat and tidy. Or as neat and tidy as possible. And there we have a vine. So I'm going to weave in this end and then do the same thing on that side. I'll be back. So here we have both of the vines and leaves done, and I am going to take a break for the evening, and I will see you in the morning. The light will be very different. Okay, it's the morning, and it's actually perfect lighting for filming because it's overcast and not too much sun, so that is actually good for filming. It's kind of gloomy outside though. But I have my coffee, I have my stitching, so let's get started. I think that I would like to continue with my lazy daisies, and I have there are 5 lazy daisies around this flower, kind of in the middle here, and then 6 on this flower. So I think I'm going to do those. And if we look at our, you know, our model, they're both in the same color, and that color is 326. So it is a kind of magenta-y color. So I will grab 3 strands of that, and I bet we'll see. We'll see how far I can get with both of these. I may need to use two different strand, like 2 different pieces, but I might not. So give me a sec and I will figure that out. And I think for this, I'm going to do an away knot. This is a pretty bright color for being behind the white fabric. So I'm going to do an away knot. So I just do a quilter's knot on the end. And I will just pop my knot over there. And I don't think I'm going to weave this in until the end, just because I don't have much to weave it into until I get in the middle here will be a bunch of little French knots, and that I can weave into the back of French knots. It's really hard to weave into the back of lazy daisies. So I will do my lazy daisies here. And like I said, I have 3 strands of 326. And if you remember, I only did the full circle on one of them. Most of them, what I did was this kind of just the tacking down line. So that way, in case my loops aren't so great, which, you know, my loops aren't always perfect, although that's a really good loop, if I do say so myself. This way, it would make sure to cover everything. And if you notice, I'm starting inside of this circle here. I don't know if you can see. This circle here, that's where our French knots will go, but I'm starting the petals inside that. So that way they are a good size, and I will cover that. I'll still cover all of this with French knots, and I'll just cover these stitches. And there we have a flower. And so in the middle of this will be yellow French knots, and I am, do I want to jump? What I might do, and this is something that works really well, I find, is if you look at this, you know, model, this flower here is fully filled in with satin stitch and French knots, and it's very close to this flower here with those lazy daisies. So what I'm going to do is I am going to, where is that? That's right there. I'm going to come here. I'm gonna weave in through the back of this to direct my floss where I want it to go. And then I'm gonna do a little tacking down stitch right in the middle of this flower. It's gonna be covered, right? And so then all you have is this tiny little jump right there that's going to be completely covered. This here is going to be covered. And what that means then is that I can just jump over and do a like backwards lazy daisy. So where you do the tacking down stitch first. And I'll use the 3 strands. So I don't want that too tight, or else I can't get my needle through. And then I just put my needle through. And I didn't have to start a new thread. And then we just do regular lazy daisies in these loops. And for this one, because I'm doing an outline in a back stitch, they can be small and I don't have to start them inside the circle. So this circle here is going to be satin stitched. And just make sure you don't get your loop twisted. That is a different kind of stitch. I think it's called a twisted chain stitch. So it's a different kind of stitch that has a very different effect, but is very effective. And there we go. So I'm going to actually weave it in down here. So I'm going to kind of scoop behind here and weave it in. And as I said, I'm going to leave this away knot in for this flower until I get those French knots in, and then I can, you know, do that one. Alternately, I could wait until I stitch this flower and do it that way as well. And in fact, I think this flower is going to come next. So this flower is using a satin stitch in the petals and French knots in the middle in yellow. So I will do the satin stitch first because I kind of, you know, I want to use do all the yellow at the same time just in case I can not get different strands. For this inner flower here, I'm using 2 strands of the 3844, which is this bright teal color. And we're doing a satin stitch for these petals, but the satin stitch is different than the one that we did on this side. So if you can see here, they're all kind of evenly in a row, and they are all going in exactly the same direction, which is common for a satin stitch. However, with flowers, you want the petals to be somewhat differentiated, and you want them all kind of facing into the middle. So for this, what we're going to do is we're going to do each petal individually. And what I like to do is I like to start in the middle of a petal and do a line towards the middle. And then I go to the edge of the petal and do a line and follow that line. And then go to the other side and do the other edge of the petal. And now I have this petal essentially mapped out. And I go into the middle of one of these sections and into the middle. I do all my long stitches first. Go to the middle of this section here and into the middle, and then I go into the middle of this section over here and back into the middle. And so that's fairly well covered, I think, but we want it very smooth. So then what you have to do is just kind of fill in the gaps. And so I just take one more on the outside. And I'm not going to go all the way to the middle because we don't want that to get super bulky. So I go between these two and just between these 2 threads that we've already done and just fill in the gap. And then I do the same thing over here. Come up where there's a gap, find the gap and fill it in. And then, as you can see, it looks like a clamshell, essentially. Essentially you're kind of making a little clamshell. And then I do the same thing. And so I come up in the middle, go down in the middle, and this inner, I try to make it as neat as possible, but this inner circle here, this inner edge, edge of the petals will be covered in French knots, so you won't even see it. So if it's looking a little bit messy, that's okay. And there we have a petal. A nicely filled in, shiny, satin stitched petal. So I'm going to do the rest of the petals and then I will come back. Okay, so I finished that all around and I have woven in all of the ends, and you'll see I wove the pink ends into there and then both blue ends into there as well. What I want to do now is do the outline of this flower in its back stitch. and that is using 151, which is a light pink. So I'm going to start in the center, do a loop start, and like not rip my fabric and everything, and then just do a back stitch around the line. And you can tell in the pattern that it's a back stitch because it is a dotted line. Oh, and the satin stitch you can tell because it's grayed in. The dark circles are French knots, and then the dark outline is a chain stitch. And you'll see up here that is also a satin stitch, which we'll do with the gray going forward. And there we have it. So we have the outline and the inside of the petals for this flower. Now I did 3 or 4 stitches per side of each petal, depending on whether it was going all the way to the center or if it was touching like there onto the petal next to it. So I'm going to weave in this thread in the back and we will start on our yellow. All right, so we have our yellow, and in the center of this, what we're doing is a very little satin stitched circle. And then we'll jump over and do these French knots in the middle of those flowers. And this will just be a basic satin stitch where everything is going in the same direction and catching on my needle minder as it does. And I do like to frame it out and put basically guidelines, stitch in some guidelines, but this should not take very many stitches at all. It's a very small circle. And you can go in any direction. I'm basically following this petal here, but you can follow whichever petal or go any direction that you want. And that's it. It's a very effective little yellow middle. And I'm going to jump over here and do some French knots. And so to do that, I kind of go behind everything, catch at least one little thread in the blue, and then I'm where I need to be. And so what I do when I am filling in a circle with French knots, I'll start on the outside and kind of work my way in. I'll go all the way around the outside and work in, or alternately I'll do one in the middle and then work out from there. And one thing to keep in mind is that the knot goes where you come down through the fabric. So if you want to put a knot, you know, somewhere random, you can come up wherever you want, but you want to go down exactly where you want that knot to be. So there we have I probably shouldn't have done that final knot, but I'm not going to worry about it. So that's that. And then I'm going to jump in and kind of weave my way to the middle of the pink one. There we go. Yeah, my yellow thread's really knotting up today. I'm not quite sure why. I think for this one, I'm going to do a knot in the middle and then do a ring of knots around it. And there we go. So now we have all of our yellow in. I kind of want, I'm gonna go rogue because I don't want there to be a gap. There's a gap. I'm gonna put it right in there in that gap. There we go. See, there we go. I did not mess that one up. So that is the inside of the hoop done. So I'm gonna, you know, weave in my ends, and I think we'll start over here. I think I'm gonna do this satin stitch on the top and the bottom of the spool. So let me weave in all my ends and get that organized. All right, so what I did was I wove into the back here of the hoop, and in my model I have one little stitch there. I'm going to do that little stitch, and then I'm going to do the satin stitch across and then do a little stitch on the other side. So that way the top of the spool is done. And I'm doing it in 2 strands. I like to do, I know I've mentioned this before, but I like to do satin stitch with 2 strands because it gives you fine enough detail that the satin stitch usually lays pretty nicely, but it doesn't take as long as 1 strand, because 1 strand is ideal, honestly, but I don't have time for ideal. So I'm gonna work this straight up and down according to the spool. Now at this point we are in the middle, and so what I do is this last stitch that I just did, I go right next to it below this little hole, you know, the hole in the spool, and then I go above the hole in the spool, and I kind of go back and forth. And then at this point we can start with our full ones again, and we have a little hole in the middle. So I'm going to finish this up, and I'm going to finish the bottom as well. The bottom I used an angled stitch. I felt like to try and get some kind of movement, because this is just the bottom of the spool. Let me show you a spool. To my mind, you know, we're looking at it like, let me see if I can see, like that. So all you're seeing here is just the, you know, the edge of the spool, which in my mind is angled a bit. Did it work out how I wanted it? Not exactly, but I like the effect. So I'm going to finish up this top of the spool and the bottom of the spool, and then come back and we will work on the blue of the thread. All right, so I finished up the top, did that extra little stitch right there, and then I did the bottom, and I ended up doing the bottom. I don't know if you can see. I ended up doing the bottom in a similar way that I did the petals, where I kind of made the ends face in and the middle face straight up, and then I kind of did guidelines, my guidelines along the edge to get a bit of an angle in, right? Does that make sense? Right there. And I like it much better than what I did before. So now we're going to work on this blue, and that is a back stitch around the outside, some straight stitches to give the impression of thread, and then this thread here is a split stitch. And in the pattern you can tell that these are back stitches because of the dotted lines, and then you can tell the split stitch by the very long dotted line, and then the rest of them are all straight stitches. Now I'm going to do this in a loop start, and in the pattern, well, let's show you this. In the model I went up, over, and down. I might actually go this way and then weave back up, but regardless, in the pattern it does not have this top stitch as this sort of top line as a back stitch in the blue, but I really liked it, so that's what I did. So I'm going to start here and do my loop start, if I can get it to work. And this is just a simple back stitch. Now you could also do the straight stitches first and then cover the ends with the back stitch. But because I wanted to do a loop start, that doesn't work quite so well. And we'll see how much thread I have. I probably won't have enough thread to do everything I want to do. When I'm stitching for myself, I will often do sewing method for the back stitch as well. It just goes quicker, but you are trading accuracy for speed, which is, you know, a trade-off that I'm willing to make, but not everyone is. We have a very loud, very long train going by. I don't know if you can hear that. And for the last stitch, I want to make sure the last stitch comes up in the right spot, and so I would do that. But you can see how, you know, this side is neater looking than this side. So you sacrifice for speed. I want to do this line right here, right? It goes like that. So I want to come up in this spot here. I don't know if you can see that right there, but that's where I went down. So I have to go around the back, scoop up a couple threads, and then it's locked in. I don't have to worry about it coming out again. And you can follow the lines here to see where your straight stitches are going to be. Now I want to go up to this one here. I don't know if you can see that. I want to go up to this one, this little tiny line, but I don't want, I'm here now. I don't want to jump across there, so I'm going to weave back and up and then come over. So I weave in the back, go back sort of where I came from, and then I can travel up and come out here. So the goal is really to just do as short of jumps as possible so that you don't, I don't know, so you don't see them in the front. So that is it for the sort of straight lines of thread. So now I'm going to weave this in and get out another piece to do the split stitch thread that goes through the needle. I'm going to do a split back stitch because that's easier for me and I prefer them to a standard split stitch. But we are following this line here. That is kind of the thread that's through this needle. And here you can see it is a split stitch that just kind of curves around. So we're going to do that. And we're actually going to use this split stitch to make this line here curve. You see that this is a very long straight stitch, but we want the line to actually curve down a little bit. So when I get to that point, I'm going to like stitch through that in my split back stitch. That's kind of the great thing about embroidery, surface embroidery, is that you can adjust things in post-production essentially. I'm using 2 strands. I did not loop start. I wove it into the back because I wasn't quite sure if I would have enough with the loop start, with like the strand folded over. So now that we are on a tight curve, you want to kind of make your stitches smaller so you get a nice curve. And you can use your stitch again to place, you know, adjust the previous stitch. That's again the great thing about, I love me some surface embroidery. And remember I said I want to guide that stitch where I want it to be. So I'm coming up in front of it. And now I'm coming up on the other side of it. I'm going through the previous stitch. So now it's trapped under that. And so now what I'm going to do is do my next stitch, and when I go through, let's see if I can do this here. when I go through this stitch, this next stitch, I hope you can see this, I'm going right next to where I want, no, I don't want to split it. Right next to where I want that previous stitch to be, and it's slightly curved. That was the goal. And it's not stitched down. I didn't stitch through the stitch. I stitched around the stitch and kind of trapped it where I wanted it to be. I'm going a little bit over the spool so that it looks like it's traveling around. So that is all of the thread on this spool, and all we have left to do is the gray. So we have a satin stitch at the top covered by 2 straight stitches, and then this is 2 straight stitches in line that create the needle. And then we are done with this stitching. So let me weave in this end and get my gray ready, and we'll get finished. All right, so at the top here, all we have are just like 5 horizontal satin stitches, and then 2 vertical stitches that are the holding the hoop. So this is the hoop screw, and this is the, you know, the metal that the screw goes through. And then over here we have just one, we just have a needle, which is essentially a long stitch, a gap, and then a short stitch. So this is, I'm using again 2 strands of DMC 4, and I am kind of outlining in the thread, so I know exactly where I want to go. And then I just fill it in. And this should take 5 long stitches. That's the hope, 5 long stitches. Because 3 isn't quite enough in my mind to make it really nice and covered to there. There we go. That actually looks pretty full coverage, so I may only use 4 in there. And then we do our lines that cover it. And this has 2 purposes, actually. This not only makes the little metal pieces that the screw fits into for a hoop, but it also tacks down those satin stitches, which are slightly longer than I like. But for this, it I think is very effective. That's all we have to do for that. I'm going to weave in those ends, come over here, and do a loop start, and then just do a quick stitch there. I think actually my loop start is just going to be this end, this sort of short stitch of the needle. And then we have a longer stitch that has to go over this, you know, this thread that is running through. And that's it. That's the end. All I need to do is weave in this end, and the stitching, the embroidery on this is finished. You know, I taught you just a handful of simple stitches, and we made a very simple pattern because I'm expecting beginners to do this, but you can combine these simple stitches in all sorts of different ways to make really intricate and interesting patterns. Embroidery is just building on simple stitches in complicated and interesting ways. So that is it from my work table for today. In our next video, I'm going to show you how to create this book. And as I said before, this is all hand stitched. You do not need a sewing machine to make this book. And it is quite robust. It is really, I mean, I think very well made. And I think it looks very decorative. So for example, the binding is just done in a chain stitch, which I think looks really pretty. So I will say goodbye to you today, and I will see you next week for the grand finale of our Needlebook Embroidery 101 project. Bye.